So, Mr. Canuto, you're a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, principal at the Center for Macroeconomics and Development, former vice president and executive director at the World Bank, executive director at the IMF, as well as vice president of the Inter-American Development Bank. So, Mr. Canuto, over the previous months, we have witnessed a change of stance in central banks' policies, going from a very accommodative one in order to support and boost the economy during the COVID-19 period to a very restrictive one today in order to counter inflation. So, according to you, Mr. Canuto, what are the leverages of central banks in order to counter inflation without jeopardizing the economies? What are the toolkits that they can use and on what they can lean for doing that?
It's a pleasure to be here and be interviewed by you. And I would say the following. There has been a change of stance, as you correctly highlighted, from taking the inflationary phenomenon of the beginning of the last year and beginning of this year from temporary ones to a perception that they might not be here to stay. And under those circumstances, there is no other possibility but central banks tightening monetary policies and tightening financial conditions, because that's the way to compress demand and avoid that the shocks, the inflationary shocks, even if they come from the supply side, they might contaminate expectations. And if those shocks are transmitted to expectations and they become entrenched, then it's going to be hard to curtail the inflation, as we watched in the 70s and 80s. Then, at a certain moment, there was a postponement of the tightening, and the result was that later on, the Federal Reserve Bank, for instance, had to tighten even deeper, and things got worse in the 80s. So there was no other option. Even in the case of the Eurozone, where we know that the supply shocks had even a higher weight in explaining the inflation, but there is no option. The ECB, the European Central Bank, will remain tightened so as to, the issue is basically avoiding the contamination of expectations and the retrenchment of inflation into the normal functioning of the economies. And there is no other option for the central banks but to tighten. Where that will lead us to, particularly in the case of emerging markets and commodity price. In the case of commodity price, not by chance, the forecasts have all pointed out to a softer price movements in 2023. And the challenge for emerging markets will be to live with higher interest rates abroad. But again, there is a deep heterogeneity among developing countries, with countries ranging on one extreme in very vulnerable positions because of their debt, because of the combination of price shocks with financial conditions that are not, let's say, solid. But on the other hand, at the same time, you have some emerging markets that have managed to cross the 2022 terrible year in terms of shocks with the reserves, and are coping quite well. It's not by chance that, for instance, while the dollar appreciated vis-a-vis most currencies in the world, in the case of some emerging markets, it has been contrary-wise. The dollar has devalued vis-a-vis the Mexican peso and the Brazilian real, for instance, to give an idea on how different are the conditions in the spectrum of emerging markets.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for these insights, Mr. Canuto. And moving to my next questions. So in reaction to the latest Federal Open Market Committee, 75% of the economists answering to a Bloomberg News survey confirmed that a recession is to be expected within the next 2 years. So according to you, what would be the impacts of this recession on emerging countries mainly? What are the sectors that are most likely to be affected? But most of all, would this recession be enough to tame the current levels of inflation?
Right. We do have three different possible scenarios when it comes to establishing the outcome of the ongoing tightening. One, the most benign one, would be a soft landing.
Yes.
That is to say, the inflation rates start to reflect the tightening of monetary policy not long ahead, and so the degree of a softening in labor markets doesn't have to be very deep, so that's the most benign scenario, the one of a soft landing. On the other hand, the one that is more likely is that as we could see in the resilience of core inflation indices in the last few months, is not going to be that simple. The inflation rates will not, let's say, reflect the tightening immediately. The job market remains strong relatively strong in the U.S.,
yes,
even in Europe. So most likely, the Federal Reserve Bank and the ECB will be obliged to tighten enough so as to really see rising unemployment rates and so on. And so we might have, as a second scenario, a possible deeper recession than the soft landing. But there is yet a third scenario, which would be the combination of the deep recession with some sort of negative surprise on the financial side. Okay. The degrees of leverage in parts of the financial system make them vulnerable, and surprise may come. We could suggest several possible places where we might have, if we have any sort of a liquidity crisis in some specific markets, that transmit themselves into the whole system, then we might have the worst scenario, which would be a combination of financial shocks with the deeper recession. Where we are and where we go, no one can claim to know exactly that. But there's no option since the monetary policy has to tighten.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Canuto. And now I'm moving back to the heterogeneity that we talk about. And here I'm going to be asking you if all countries will be experiencing the same economic cycle at the same time. And here I'm mainly referring to China, a country that is still caught up in a very restrictive COVID-19 policy. And if not, if we have overlapping economic cycles between major worldwide economies, what would be the impact of that scenario?
Great that you call attention to the fact that China is also decelerating its growth on its own path for other reasons. The deceleration issue in China is not due to the kind of shock phenomenon that we were referring to in the case of Europe and US and Japan, but for other reasons. First of all, the zero COVID policy, which is still inflicting confinements and supply shocks on its own. But there is also the huge impact that China suffered from droughts and floods and the supply shocks derived from adverse weather phenomenon. This thing, of course, China is on a common place vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Yes. That's something that came to stay, apparently. The higher frequency of adverse weather phenomenon. And that was particularly important in China this year because it led to energy rationing, closing some cities in order to avoid the consumption of energy. But there is a third factor besides the COVID zero and the adverse weather phenomenon, which is the situation at the real estate sector.
Yes.
See, in the case of China, I particularly personally remember quite well. I was side by side with President Hu Jintao in 2011 at the Hall of People when he gave a speech. At the time I was a vice president at the World Bank. And President Hu Jintao gave a speech on China's rebalancing. and he referred to the need to move away from the investment-led model, trade surplus-led model, towards one based on consumption and so on, and lower investment, lower economic growth, but at least more solid and very well, let's say, with spillovers, with the incorporation of the Chinese population. Okay, that was then, but at the same time, we know how the Chinese are afraid of any slump if they had to move automatically from one growth model to another, consumption-based, given the low levels of consumption as a share of GDP in China, even nowadays. They decided to cross the river, as they like to use the image, stepping stone by stone, using investments in infrastructure and in housing as a way to gradually move down the pace of growth and the pace of investment. And they did it. But the problem is that accompanied by over-investment in not only in some infrastructure segments, but in housing.
Yes.
And by doing so, they managed to smooth the adjustment downward of the growth rate of China from the 2 digits of the previous decades to gradually 6% in 2019 before the pandemic, but with the price of an increasing vulnerability of the real estate sector. Mm-hmm. This matters particularly now because I don't expect, like many, any sort of collapse of the Chinese real estate. But the real estate sector cannot be relied on as a growth stimulus, as it was the case over the last decade. Mm. And that's why I believe that those structural reasons are responsible for the slide down of growth in China towards 3.5 as the new normal for the Chinese growth rate. So for different reasons, but China's deceleration is happening exactly at the same time as we will be obliged to live with the lower growth rates as well in Europe and the United States.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Canuto. In my last question also, I'll be referring back to a concept that you talked about in your first answer, and which is the stronger USD. So we know that foreign exchange markets and commodity markets have been historically strongly linked together. Yeah. So according to you, what are the impacts of a stronger USD on the commodity market today? Right. And are there some commodities more impacted than other commodities in terms of stronger USD?
Yes, definitely so. That's a good question. Not by chance. There has always been a peg between the value of the dollar and oil price, for instance. But I would call attention to the fact that a strong dollar, a strengthening of the dollar has a contractionary effect on the global economy, because on the U.S. side, of course, a stronger dollar mitigates inflation. It helps inflation to go down because of the cheapening of imports and so on. But given the low, let's say, rate of opening of the U.S. economy, the downward impact on inflation in the U.S. is less than proportional to the inflationary impact that the dollar appreciation has on many of the other countries on the other side. And so this is making tougher the life for, let's say, European Union and other countries that will have to cope not only with their own domestic inflation shocks, but also with the shocks stemming from the dollar appreciation vis-a-vis their currencies, vis-a-vis the euro and the sterling pound and so on. So that's why they will be obliged to tighten even further because of this additional shock on their inflation. And also, this is so strong that even those who have tried to avoid the pressure stemming from the U.S. depreciation, like Japan, they were obliged to do it increasingly in a more difficult manner. Japan will have to concede. It will have to raise interest rates eventually, but the problem is that that might affect the debt sustainability of Japan, which is humongous. In the past, people always ask me about the likelihood of a new Plaza Accord. The Plaza Accord was signed among U.S., Japan, France, Germany in 1985, where they agreed on devaluation of the dollar, given the strength that it was at the time. One important difference is the following. Back in 1985, the tight monetary policy of the U.S. had already reached its results in terms of dampening inflation. And so it was easier for the U.S. simply to say, okay, I'm going to relax my monetary policy, and that way make the ground for a dollar depreciation. That's not the case yet. We still, speaking as of now, we still have a process of monetary adjustment that is still in the middle of the way.
Yes.
So the U.S. cannot promise that they would reduce their interest rate so as to accommodate. So one thing that can be done now definitely would be the revival of the Federal Reserve Bank's swap lines with other central banks, as they did, as it happened during the pandemic financial shock, so as to widen the scope for the other central banks to intervene in the markets and to kind of mitigate the pressure towards devaluation of their currencies. That's something that might help. Whereas any sort of full agreement at a broader level, I don't believe they're feasible in the short term. We'll have to live with it. But the dollar, the USD appreciation brings new challenge to the context that we live in through.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Mr. Canuto, for all of your views and valuable insights that help us understand a little more the current economic context within the current crisis of commodities and also foreign exchange markets, like we just mentioned in this answer. We would have loved to extend the format of this interview, but unfortunately we will have to stop at this question. Thank you again very much, Mr. Canuto, and I'm looking forward to meeting you again at the Policy Center for the New South.
It will be a pleasure.
Thank you very much.